Hello, guys. This is Rodney Chan, and today I will be doing a mock IOC on By Child, and so this is the today is what the Friday, January 25th, 2019, and so basically, I haven't really looked at this poem at all. Okay, in class we analyzed it, but this is this will give you an idea. So if I do bad on this, you'll understand why. I did not study beforehand. I only gave myself the 20 seconds to prepare for this. The 20 minutes, I mean, to prepare for this mock, like the real thing. And I took a 5 minute break, and now I'll be starting 8 minutes. Wish me luck, okay, guys? Okay, the poem By Child by Seamus Heaney was written as a response to a newspaper article in the Irish Times, which Heaney saw depicting a child, a boy, who was found in a barn who had been neglected by his mother for the last 2 years, basically. And in this in this situation, he was found not being able to speak, not being able to really communicate, and of course severely malnourished. And in this poem by Heaney tries to prove the idea that the relationship between this female and this child represents Ireland. But although it may seem that the female is actually the aggressor, it is also the child who is this relationship between the two of them. Both sides of them represent Ireland, how Ireland is destroying itself and how it must change. My first argument will be talking about the type of animal imagery that is prevalent throughout the play. And my point is that the animal imagery is actually used as not only a means to describe the child's actions, but to describe how if you're going back into time, you are actually regressing. And first, we will analyze this. The in the second stanza, the the first line of the second stanza describes a hen house as part of the boy's identity. This idea that the habitat that you live in actually affects you is very much related to the idea of how those living in Ireland actually have their entire landscape affecting them. Considering the fact that in many of Heaney's poems, he focuses on pastoral imagery. This imagery that almost glorifies the rural landscape, which is not prevalent in this poem. And I feel like this adjective, this choice of diction, it specifically is used to outline the development of the boy over time. So he starts out as as this being described as a henhouse, but then in the next stanza, he's described as the moon man, and this the fact that he's grown up, but at the same time, the next line in the stanza 3 after moon man, it says kennelled and faithful. This idea immediately springs up the idea of the dog. But who is this little animal dog boy man faithful to? And this can be found in stanza 4, the fourth line of stanza 4, in which it says, she put through your trapdoor those scraps, the dry smells from the scraps. And this is largely a metaphor, because this is the only mention of the mother in the entire poem, aside from that little blurb that is provided at the beginning. The mention of the mother as this ideal provider, the one who is giving him these scraps. You see that even though he is being from our point of view, this child is being severely malnourished, mistreated, and in general, we are very cynical of the situation. You also can discern that she is the one that keeps him alive to an extent. And this leads me to my next point that I'm going to make, which is that the light imagery that is very prevalent in the play is also related to this religious imagery. And the idea that, connecting to my thesis, the Ireland's society is taking the ideas, the dogmatisms of religion, and turning it into something that is not representative of what it should be. And of course, the most prevalent um, proof of this idea is in the second last stanza, in which this obvious religious imagery, the vigils, the solitudes, the fasts, unchristened tears, this attitude is almost as if the boy is worshipping the mother. And what we choose to do, as in a religious faith, is forced upon the child. The tears are unchristened, which means they're not blessed, but he still has this love of the light. And this imagery is about suffering. But usually when we think of suffering, because of the world we live in, we as the reader think of it as in the point of view of the Irish people, we see these tears and we think of suffering of our own volition, of our own will. And that is not the case here. The whole point of this is that his suffering is not something that he enjoys, but there is this warped love of it, this puzzled love of the light. And of course, as I said, the light imagery, the idea of the moon man, the yoke of light in the first stanza, so many references as this extended metaphor to in this idea of figurative language, to really emphasize the fact that the moon is like an idol, and also it is something that you look up to with hope. And although you only catch the slightest glimpse of it, as this child does in the first stanza, it says he puts his eye to a chink, you still, the fact that you see so little of this hope, is what keeps you hoping. If you see too much of it, you'll only get used to it. And this is okay. And I feel like this religious imagery, there is a huge tonal shift in the last line, in which in the last stanza of the poem, in which they say, with a remote mind of something beyond patience, your gaping wordless proof. This shows that language transcends the barriers, that he cannot even speak. He cannot even make sounds, as the first blurb says, that he was incapable of saying anything. So this relates back to the idea of the animal noises, that although there's so much animalistic, so many examples of the animal in the poem, the noises are not being made. And this all culminates back in my thesis, that the idea that this relationship is a one-person journey, and that although Ireland as a whole is suffering underneath this. And I'm out of time, guys. So when you're on your actual IOC, then someone will ask you a question. And in my mock IOC for the Grobble Man, basically I did not talk about sound devices enough. So then my teacher, Ms. Paula Greco, asked me, sound devices, okay, the question was like, oh, how did they use sound devices? And then I would have another 2 minutes to talk about it. Okay, so now I'll just continue the timer and talk about sound devices, because everyone forgets to talk about sound devices and structure enough, so she makes sure that you have to talk about that. So thank you, Rodney. Okay, now so tell me about how the sound devices work in your poem. Okay then, so there are two examples of alliteration which I think do contribute to the theme especially as I spoke of before in the third stanza. The idea of little moon man contrasting with the above line, little henhouse boy. This sound device as the moon and the man, it it actually is an allusion to the fact that the United States had recently landed on the moon. That while basically in in the act of landing of them on the moon, we think of patriotism and also how far mankind, as they said, one giant step for mankind, how far humanity has gotten. But then this example is the thing that crumbles it all, and it gives us this cynical look at the world. And another example of the alliteration is in the second last stanza, which says, "A puzzled love of the light." And this emphasizes the fact that the whole theme of the poem is that while the child is suffering, and while Ireland is suffering, they don't recognize the suffering and they don't act on it. So that now that when salvation actually comes, when there's an opportunity to do something, they still cannot speak. And another example of this sound devices and in general structure is the fact that there are 5 line stanzas, and this is actually relating to the idea of Ireland's identity as Heaney illustrated in his quincunx, which had 5 pillars to it. And my time is out, so I okay. Now we should if we want to look back at how I did in my analysis, you'll understand that compared to the Grobble Man, the mock one that I did, I got 19 out of 20 on it because I mentioned the 5 things that she was really looking for. I mentioned the mood, I mentioned the tone. Wait, what was it? I mentioned the tone, mood, same thing. I mentioned the literary devices, I mentioned the sound devices. I also talked about all of those things, I wrote it down somewhere, I'll tell you later, but I felt like this time my arguments were not as concise, and I felt that also my thesis, I did not, when I told you my thesis, I should have stated it more clearly. The marker in IB wants you to know, this is my thesis, and they also want you to have a good conclusion. As you heard when I was answering my the 2-minute discussion question, I did not finish. I knew I was not going to finish, but then I just wanted to talk more about that 5 line stanza thing, which doesn't even relate to sound devices, relate to the question. So those are the mistakes I made, and what else? How else can I reflect on this? I felt like if you look, I hope I put a scan of my notes somewhere. But I could my first argument was about animal imagery, but I did not. I talked a lot about the henhouse boy. I didn't really point out my devices. I didn't say, metaphor, anaphora, onomatopoeia, euphony, cacophony, whatever. Okay, so make sure that you guys, when you do your IOC, you actually name your devices more. And, okay, well, this is my analysis for By Child. Probably the worst one on my channel, or wherever I upload this. And, well, I wish you luck. Hope you get 7.